No bubble gut, no enlarged organs, no gear. That phrase sits in bodybuilding comment sections without serious challenge. The men who represented the sport's greatest aesthetic legacy didn't have guts pushing outward during a flex. The reason is more specific and more structurally disturbing than the broad conversation about steroids has ever acknowledged. Anabolic steroids entered competitive bodybuilding during the early 1950s. At the 1952 Olympics, testosterone use was already documented among Soviet weightlifters. By 1954, the practice was systematic. At the World Weightlifting Championships in Vienna, American team physician Dr. John Ziegler documented Soviet athletes using testosterone and went home to work with CIBA Pharmaceuticals on a more targeted compound. Methandrostanolone, Dianabol, was first synthesized in 1955, and the FDA approved it commercially in 1958. Within a decade, multiple testosterone derivatives were circulating through elite training environments: Winstrol, Decadurabolin, Anavar. By the mid-1960s, the Dianabol tablet was so common in some competitive gyms that bodybuilders reportedly kept them in bowls on kitchen tables, treating them the way other athletes treated vitamins. The first Mr. Olympia was held in 1965. Larry Scott won it, then won it again in 1966. The stage was pharmacologically supported from its very first competition. Through the golden era that followed, Arnold Schwarzenegger's 7 titles, Sergio Oliva's 3, Frank Zane's 3, competitive bodybuilding operated on anabolic steroids. Schwarzenegger confirmed his own use in a 1977 interview, plainly. Steroids? The answer is yes. It was just on a beginning stage, because bodybuilders in those days just experimented with it. He cycled for 8 to 10 weeks before competitions. Sergio Oliva was more comprehensive in a documented interview years later, naming the full roster of Golden Era competitors who had used them: Zane, Columbo, himself, Arnold, Larry Scott, Harold Poole, Dave Draper. Frank Zane, who trained with meticulous attention to his own biochemistry, was nicknamed the Chemist by training partners who weren't being metaphorical. Through all of it, every Olympia from 1965 to the late 1980s, not one elite competitor displayed the visible abdominal distension that became commonplace after 1992. The condition didn't appear on the elite stage until the early 1990s. By the mid to late 1990s, it was spreading through the top tier of competition, fast enough to have acquired its own name, its own vernacular, its own taxonomy of severity. The men responsible for the sport's greatest physiques had been using anabolic steroids for 30 years before the gut arrived. That is a gap of 30 to 35 years. If steroids cause bubble guts, the gut should have shown up in 1968. They showed up in 1993. Something changed around 1990, and it wasn't the existence of performance-enhancing drugs. To understand what the sport lost, you have to understand what the midsection meant during the era that produced it. Larry Scott established the competitive standard for abdominal control at the inaugural Mr. Olympia in 1965. He performed the stomach vacuum throughout his posing routine in a way that made midsection compression close to mandatory at the elite level. If you couldn't draw the stomach in and hold it, tight, flat, demonstrating control of the interior of your own torso, you were signaling a gap in your presentation. Scott made the move a standard. The first Olympia champion made the flat, compressed midsection part of the definition of what it meant to win. Frank Zane turned that standard into the defining image of his career. At 5 feet 9 inches and roughly 185 to 195 pounds at competition weight, lean enough to display striations through every major muscle group, his vacuum pose was the most technically refined version of the movement seen on any Golden Era stage. The origin of his relationship with the pose traces to 1970. Performing it at Mr. Universe, he received immediate and direct feedback from Schwarzenegger, who had been watching from the wings. As Zane later described the exchange, "The stomach vacuum was probably my best pose. I remember doing it for the 1970 Mr. Universe. Afterward, Arnold told me it was maybe my best pose, and to do it at the end of my routine. It usually brought the house down." He took the advice. From 1977 through 1979, Zane held the Mr. Olympia title and built a competitive identity around the relationship between his shoulder width and his waist. specifically the degree to which he could make his midsection disappear. The photograph of his 1979 Mr. Olympia vacuum pose, taken by his wife Christine, became the most reproduced image of what aesthetic bodybuilding was supposed to achieve. He sold autographed 8x10 prints of it for decades after retirement. The image, the midsection pulled fully inward, ribs surfacing through the skin, the internal anatomy apparently cooperating with the competitor's will, was the argument. This was the standard the sport had set for itself, before the standard changed. Steve Reeves competed even earlier, before Dianabol reached FDA approval. The photographs of Reeves from 1947 that circulate through bodybuilding culture show a waist so narrow relative to his shoulders that the proportions read as almost architectural. Not quite the human body in its ordinary configuration, but the human body redesigned to resemble a blueprint for itself. Arnold Schwarzenegger cited Reeves as his boyhood idol. The aesthetic that Schwarzenegger built his own mythology around, wide, muscular, cinematic, traced its direct lineage to Reeves' relationship between midsection and mass. None of these men were competing without pharmaceutical support. That point matters for what follows. Sergio Oliva named the full list. Arnold confirmed his own use. The golden era ran on steroids: testosterone esters, Dianabol, Decadurabolin, Primobolin, Anavar, at doses that looked moderate by current standards, but were meaningfully pharmacological. Zane earned the chemist, not as irony, but as a straightforward description of how he approached preparation. The drugs they used, though, built skeletal muscle through androgen receptors. They didn't ask the organs to grow. That's the line. And understanding why requires understanding what the pharmacological landscape of the 1970s and early 1980s actually contained, and specifically, what was absent from it. Until 1985, human growth hormone existed in exactly one form available to any athlete, extracted from the pituitary glands of human cadavers. The supply wasn't just limited by economics or regulation. It was physically bounded by anatomy. A Los Angeles Times investigation from 1986 documented the arithmetic. It took approximately 50 human cadavers to supply a single child with enough growth hormone for 1 year of medical treatment. The National Pituitary Agency, a federal program collecting pituitaries from autopsies across the country, was rationing the compound to severely growth-deficient children. There was no surplus. There was barely enough for the medical cases with absolute clinical need. Athletic use was effectively impossible at that scale. The dose a competitive bodybuilder would require to produce meaningful tissue growth, year-round, at the levels the sport would eventually normalize, couldn't be sourced from any realistic number of cadavers. And the risk of attempting it wasn't only logistical. Cadaver-derived HGH carried the prion responsible for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a fatal neurological condition that can incubate for decades before symptoms appear. The FDA suspended all cadaver-derived HGH distribution in 1985 when the contamination link was confirmed. Dan Duchaine had been writing about growth hormone since 1982. His Underground Steroid Handbook, described by academic sources as the first publication to publicly advocate HGH as a performance-enhancing agent, named the compound as theoretically valuable. He would go on to advocate stacking growth hormone with insulin and thyroid medications as a pharmacological synergy. But in 1982, that stack was largely theoretical. The supply ceiling made widespread athletic adoption non-deployable. Duchaine was describing a concept the market couldn't yet support. What changed everything was recombinant DNA. The FDA approved Somatrim, sold as Protropin, in 1985, the first synthetic human growth hormone produced through biotechnology rather than extracted from cadavers. The supply ceiling disappeared. Recombinant production could be scaled with manufacturing capacity, not with mortality rates. By 1987, a more refined formulation, somatropin, was in development. By 1989, it was documented that biotechnology had made HGH significantly more accessible on both the legitimate market and the black market. There was no longer a physical reason the compound couldn't reach competitive athletes. Then, in July 1990, Dr. Daniel Rudman published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine. 12 men over 60, all with low IGF-1 levels, received recombinant HGH injections 3 times weekly for 6 months. Results: lean body mass increased by nearly 9%. Fat mass decreased by 14%. Skin thickness increased. Lumbar bone density improved. Newspapers around the world ran the findings. Anti-aging clinics mobilized. And competitive bodybuilders, watching a compound that could produce extraordinary tissue growth become suddenly and inexpensively manufacturable, understood exactly what the numbers in that study meant for a sport that measured results in centimeters of arm circumference. The compound was now obtainable. The sport had a structural incentive to obtain it. Insulin followed within 2 to 3 years. The documentation of its arrival describes the initial phase as improvised. When insulin first announced its presence in the early 90s, programs were simplistic and failed to capitalize on some of insulin's most powerful properties. Type 1 diabetics were reportedly selling insulin pen fills on the black market to competitive athletes seeking access. The protocols were crude. The results on mass accumulation were visible enough that adoption spread through competitive circles the way any effective technology spreads through a competitive environment, because the people who didn't adopt it were losing. Milos Sarcev, a competitive bodybuilder who became associated within the sport with introducing insulin protocols to professional training, later described in documented interviews how and why he brought the compound into competitive bodybuilding. Bodybuilding culture refers to him as the godfather of insulin. His current stated position has a particular quality to it. Sarcev now says publicly that bodybuilders with distended stomachs should be disqualified on the spot. The person credited with introducing the compound most implicated in the condition now considers the result a disqualifying offense. The competitive arms race wasn't conspiratorial. It was self-reinforcing. When one competitor began using HGH and showed extraordinary tissue growth, the response of every competitor watching was rational. They needed the same tools. By the early 1990s, the stack of anabolic steroids plus growth hormone plus insulin plus extreme caloric loading was becoming standard practice at the elite level. The aesthetic consequence of that stack was still a few years from being fully visible. But the biological foundation for what would happen was already being laid, organ by organ, inside the abdominal cavity of every competitor running the protocol. Dorian Yates arrived at exactly this pharmacological inflection point. The British competitor had finished second at the 1991 Mr. Olympia, behind Lee Haney, completing his 8th and final consecutive title. Haney retired. Yates won in 1992, the first of 6 straight Olympia titles he'd hold through 1997. His competitive protocol at peak weight has been documented through multiple accounts. At approximately 140 kilograms of competition-prepared body weight, Yates ran roughly 1,000 milligrams of testosterone weekly, combined with either decadurabolin or boldenone, daily dianabol orals, growth hormone, and insulin. One contemporary account of the era describes the pharmacological environment directly: in steroids and growth hormone and insulin and diuretics. The compound list was different in kind from what the golden era had used. Not just larger doses of the same tools, but different tools with different biological targets and different anatomical consequences. His progression from 1992 to 1993 circulated through the training community with the quality of a seismic event. Photographs showing the physical change between those 2 Olympia appearances were described at the time as having scared the hell out of Flex magazine when they appeared. The mass accumulated in that single year was substantial enough that the physique no longer read as continuous with the aesthetic tradition that had preceded it. This wasn't a larger version of what Arnold had been. It was something categorically different, denser, fuller, operating in a size range that made the golden era physiques look like a different sport. The gut wasn't immediately the defining feature of Yates's physique. His conditioning was extreme, his separation was documented. But as his career progressed and the protocol continued year after year, the midsection and relaxed poses told a different story. Discussion of his later physique describes a bloated stomach and blocky waist that had become visible and noted. The condition was developing, as it develops in clinical GH excess, gradually, cumulatively, in response to chronically elevated IGF-1 in a body that was producing more visceral tissue response with each passing year of the protocol. The condition received its formal vernacular name from another competitor of the same transitional period. Dave Palumbo competed in his first NPC national competition in 1990 in New York City, finishing 6th at 168 pounds. Over the following years, consistently placing near but never reaching a professional card, the abdominal distension he developed became pronounced enough to define him. An academic paper on the condition includes a photograph captioned, "Figure 3 shows the distended abdomen of Dave Palumbo." The bodybuilder became the clinical illustration. The condition named after him, Palumboism, entered competitive bodybuilding's vocabulary as the formal name for what HGH and insulin stacking had produced. Ronnie Coleman represents the condition's full normalization. Coleman won 8 consecutive Olympia titles from 1998 through 2005, tying Haney's record, while representing a physique that bore almost no visual resemblance to anything the sport had produced before his era. At competition weight, Coleman carried approximately 138 kilograms of conditioned mass at 180 centimeters, a size that required extreme pharmacological support to build and maintain. A Flex magazine article from Coleman's dominant years addressed his midsection with editorial pragmatism. Ronnie has a rather large stomach, but he holds it in well on stage, as do other big guys. Competitors aren't judged on stomach alone. That sentence is the institutional record in plain text. The mainstream bodybuilding press was acknowledging the distension visibly enough to name it in print. The competitive judging wasn't penalizing it. Coleman kept winning 8 times. The incentive structure was clear. Mass won. The gut came with the mass. The gut didn't cost anything on the score sheet. The physiological explanation for what happened to these competitors is specific enough to have a name in clinical medicine, and clear enough to follow without a biology degree. When a competitor injects exogenous HGH, the primary metabolic response occurs in the liver. The liver processes the growth hormone signal and produces insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1. That's the actual tissue growth agent. IGF-1 circulates systemically through the bloodstream and binds to receptors distributed throughout every major tissue type in the body. Those receptors aren't selective for skeletal muscle. The liver has IGF-1 receptors. The intestines have them, specifically the enterocytes lining the intestinal wall. The kidneys have them. The spleen has them. Every major visceral organ responds to chronically elevated IGF-1. And when that elevation is produced by supraphysiological doses of exogenous growth hormone running year-round, those organs respond to the signal the same way skeletal muscle does. They grow, not through water retention, not through fat deposition, through actual structural hypertrophy and hyperplasia. The organ tissue physically increases in volume and cell number. The liver's hepatocytes multiply. The intestinal wall thickens. The kidneys enlarge. This is structural change, not a temporary state that resolves with competition preparation. Clinical research confirms this at multiple levels. Studies show that chronic administration of growth hormone in healthy adults produces significant increases in organ weight, particularly of the liver and kidneys. Animal studies using mice engineered to continuously overproduce growth hormone show increased bowel length and mass. IGF-1 independently stimulates enterocyte proliferation. The intestinal wall's lining cells multiply in direct response, and increases total intestinal mass. At competitive dose levels, some competitors reportedly running more than 10 international units of HGH daily, which is 5 times the standard therapeutic prescription of 1 to 2 IUs at anti-aging clinics. HGH increases the thickness of the gastrointestinal wall itself. This process accelerates in the presence of the extreme caloric surplus the mass era normalized. Some competitors in this era consumed upwards of 10,000 calories daily and 1,000 grams of carbohydrates, a metabolic environment that compounds the visceral growth signal already running through every receptor. The clinical analog is acromegaly, the disease state produced when a pituitary tumor secretes excess growth hormone continuously over years. Among its documented consequences, hepatomegaly, enlargement of the liver, splenomegaly, enlargement of the spleen, and hypertrophy of the intestines and kidneys. A bodybuilder running high-dose exogenous HGH year-round approximates the physiological conditions of acromegaly in the relevant organ systems. The organs respond to elevated IGF-1 the same way regardless of whether the source is a tumor or a syringe. Enlarged organs from gear. The phrase that moves through bodybuilding comment sections is physiologically accurate description, not metaphor. The gut protrudes because the problem originates inside the abdominal cavity, not on its surface. One expert framing of the mechanics makes the anatomy plain. The abdominal distension of a competitor with advanced palumboism resembles in its physical origin late pregnancy. The pressure comes from internal volume, not from subcutaneous fat or unconditioned muscle. The competitor can develop the most trained rectus abdominis in the sport. They can hold the most perfect vacuum the transverse abdominis can produce. The enlarged liver, the thickened intestinal walls, the expanded mesentery push back from behind the abdominal wall, and the abdominal wall can't compress internal contents that have physically increased in mass and volume over years of chronic use. The muscle doesn't lose, the anatomy just isn't arranged for that fight. Insulin amplifies rather than drives independently. Insulin upregulates IGF-1 receptors and suppresses the binding proteins that would otherwise limit how much circulating IGF-1 reaches tissue-level receptors. It opens the cellular pathway wider for the growth signal already running. At therapeutic doses, insulin doesn't independently cause organ enlargement, but stacked with growth hormone at competitive dose levels, the synergistic effect on visceral tissue becomes structural rather than transient. The combination doesn't simply add the two effects, it multiplies the downstream signal at every receptor site, including the organs. Dr. Thomas O'Connor, a specialist in anabolic steroid medicine, stated the core distinction in muscle and fitness directly. It's not steroids per se. Steroids have been used back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you didn't see the bubble guts. So what happened? The bar rose. Competitors all take in more insulin, HGH, and calories, upwards of 10,000 calories a day and 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. He framed it as multifactorial. Genetics, elevated HGH and insulin, extreme caloric intake, and water retention from massive carbohydrate loading all contribute to the severity of presentation. The compound that wasn't available in the 1970s is the one that drives visceral organomegaly. The rest are accelerants. Classic anabolic steroids work through androgen receptors, concentrated in skeletal muscle and other androgen-sensitive tissues. Testosterone, dianabol, decadurabolin, primobolan. None of these compounds substantially activate the IGF-1-mediated visceral growth pathway that growth hormone triggers. They build the muscle. They don't instruct the liver or intestinal wall to hypertrophy. That's the physiological reason Frank Zane could run the pharmacological toolkit of his era and still pull his midsections so flat that the audience gasped. The compounds available to him left the abdominal cavity alone. The compounds that arrived after 1985 and became competitively standard in the early 1990s didn't. O'Connor added one observation that clarifies the dose dependency. None of the classic physique guys have bubble guts. They may use a little HGH and insulin, but they're not getting that big. Classic physique competitors aren't avoiding growth hormone and insulin entirely. They're running them below the threshold where visceral growth becomes visible distension. Below a certain dose and duration, the effect doesn't produce the gut. Above it, the anatomy becomes visible from the outside. The open division created the conditions for maximum doses over the longest possible cycles. The gut followed as a structural consequence of the competitive standard the division had set for itself. The sport didn't course correct because the sport was rewarding exactly what the sport produced. Coleman won 8 consecutive Olympia titles, while the mainstream bodybuilding press was acknowledging in print that his midsection was notable. Jay Cutler, who mounted the most serious sustained challenge to Coleman's dominance through the early 2000s, represented the same mass over aesthetic framework. Phil Heath won 7 consecutive titles from 2011 through 2017. The competitors who placed at the top of the open division through this entire period reflected the same pharmacological protocol, producing the same anatomical consequence. The judges kept rewarding them. The IFBB's published judging criteria for men's bodybuilding established standards around muscular bulk, balance development, muscular density, and definition. Abdominal distension appears nowhere as a penalizable condition. Palumboism doesn't appear. The bubble gut doesn't appear. A community petition requesting that the IFBB establish clear judging criteria against distended midsections was circulated. And the existence of that petition is itself the evidence that no such criteria existed when it was written. There is discussion within bodybuilding culture suggesting the IFBB informally moved against distension around 2017. No primary IFBB document in the available record confirms a formal policy change producing different on-stage outcomes. The competition results during this period document the condition continuing to appear in winning physiques without systematic penalty. The incentive remained. Mass won. The gut came with mass. What the Federation eventually did was create the Classic Physique Division in 2016, explicitly oriented toward the proportions of the Golden Era, described within the division as returning to physiques of the Steve Reeves type. The vacuum pose returned as a meaningful competitive element. Zane's aesthetic, the flat midsection, the V-taper, the small waist as the organizing principle of the physique, had a stage again. It's a genuine division with serious competitors. But its creation is an implicit institutional verdict. You don't build a separate room to preserve something you still have in the main room. The Open Division didn't reform its judging to bring the old aesthetic standard back. It built an annex where that standard could survive, and left the original venue to continue producing what its incentive structure had always been producing. The sport asked for monsters, and then couldn't explain why the monsters had guts. Milos Sarcev, who documented his own role in introducing the compound most implicated in the condition, now says bodybuilders with distended stomachs should be disqualified on the spot. Arnold Schwarzenegger, in a quote that is circulated alongside images of what the modern open division produces, stated the loss plainly. We want to see the most beautiful man, the most athletic man. The people who built what bodybuilding was, look at what the open division became, and describe it in terms of something having gone wrong. The Bronze Era lifters weren't clean athletes. That framing is historically false and misses the point entirely. Sergio Oliva named the full list. Arnold confirmed his own use with no apparent regret. The Golden Era ran on anabolic steroids, testosterone derivatives, orals, injectables, at doses that look moderate by current standards, but were meaningfully pharmacological by any clinical standard. Zane earned the chemist, not as irony, but as a description. Steve Reeves himself has been cited in documented accounts as having had access to the compounds arriving in the late 1950s. Nobody at the elite level was competing clean. What separated those competitors from the mass monster generation wasn't ethics or restraint or a different relationship with performance enhancement. It was access. Recombinant human growth hormone didn't exist until 1985. Competitive insulin protocols weren't documented in bodybuilding until the early 1990s. When Frank Zane stood on the 1979 Mr. Olympia stage and held his vacuum pose, midsection pulled fully inward, the entire anatomy cooperating with his competitive presentation, the pharmacological toolkit available to him contained no compound that would instruct his liver to enlarge, his intestinal wall to thicken, or his abdominal contents to push against the anterior wall with enough force to produce visible distension through a full muscular contraction. The drugs he used built extraordinary muscularity through androgen receptors in skeletal muscle. They left the abdominal cavity alone, not because he made a principled choice to protect his organs, but because the compounds that compromise organs in the specific way the bubble gut represents weren't available. If recombinant HGH had been accessible in 1977 and competitive insulin protocols had been established by then, the same competitive logic that pulled 1990s athletes toward the stack would have operated in the 1970s. The arms race isn't specific to one generation. It's specific to whatever the pharmacological landscape makes accessible and whatever the judging makes rewarding. One honest framing of the golden era captures this. There was probably every chance those competitors would have used the same modern drugs if they'd been available. The golden era wasn't moral high ground. It was a technological limitation that happened to preserve the midsection. The mechanism is anatomical and doesn't negotiate. When exogenous growth hormone elevates IGF-1 chronically at supraphysiological levels, the visceral organs with IGF-1 receptors respond to the signal. The liver grows, the intestinal wall thickens, the kidneys enlarge. The abdominal wall, no matter how developed, can't contain the internal volume that accumulates across years of high-dose use. The gut is what that physiological cascade looks like from the outside, on a stage, under competitive lighting, during a flex. The trade-off the mass era accepted, more size, more pharmacological ceiling than any previous era could access, came with an anatomical consequence built into the mechanism. The sport didn't fully account for it until the consequence had already become the dominant visual feature of the open division's elite competition. Bronze-era lifters didn't just avoid the drugs, they avoided the trade-off. They kept the stomach they trained for. Subscribe for more stories like this.